Hello. So my name is Pascal Michael, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Greenwich. And today I'm going to be talking about my research looking into the phenomenology and neuroscience of both the DMT and the near-death experience. I will actually be focusing less on NDE-mimetics, but more on Changa, which is a mix of the NDE-mimetics crystal, which is a classical psychedelic, and herbal mixture, which contains beta-carbolines, which generally enhance the DMT experience, as well as 5-MeO DMT experience, which is what I'll be looking at as well. Because in previous presentations, I've been looking at and presenting on NDE-mimetics and its relationship to near-death experiences specifically. So without further ado, so if this is the crux of my research, the relationship between psychedelics and near-death experiences, why would anyone do that? So ultimately, when you look at the two experiences, they just have enough phenomenological overlap in order to warrant further investigation to see if they are in fact involved with one another. For instance, if there are endogenous psychedelics which produce the near-death experience, and we certainly have endogenous psychedelics within us, NMDMT, as I mentioned, 5-MeO DMT, as I mentioned, there's also bufotenine. And actually serotonin, it's controversial, but serotonin may well be psychedelic in higher doses and may in and of itself be contributory to the near-death experience. Why would these chemicals potentially be released at the point of death? Because there's plentiful evidence that they are potently neuroprotective, also psychoplastogenic, that is, even capable of creating new synapses, neurites, neurons, etc. Extremely evolutionarily advantageous at the point of an anoxic brain near death. And there's plenty of recent evidence to suggest this. Also, from a theoretical perspective, using kind of much more sophisticated contemporary neuroscience, there is good reason to think that psychedelics might be released in the brain during a time when there's a supposed unconsciousness, but actually there is internal awareness, and hopefully we'll get to that at the very, very end. So ultimately, what is the near-death experience, or what is it like to be hit over the head with a bat, which is just a little funny adaptation of Thomas Nagel's famous question, what is it like to be a bat, the question of phenomenological experience. So the commonest features of near-death experience include the following, such as dissociating from the body, feeling peaceful, going through to see a bright light in the encountering with the deceased, etc. And importantly, this same paper identified that there was actually no significant statistical differences between the different features on the near-death experience scale between near-death experiences and DMT experiences. Near-death experiences and a range of other near-death-like experiences, so such as hypnosis and meditation, etc., but also drug-induced experiences, and DMT would have been a subcomponent of that. Incidentally, just to say, the near-death experience was not necessarily coined, as everyone believes, by Raymond Moody in 1975, but this is a paper by Stephen Sara in 1958. It's the first study using DMT on human subjects, and you can see here 20% of the participants reported near-death experiences, which is here, which is very, very interesting from a historical perspective, but also from a kind of technical perspective for our purposes, because DMT was at very early stages identified as on occasion producing near-death-like experiences. And again, this is just a new scale from Charlotte Marshall in Liège, to identify the features of the near-death experience, with the ones highlighted being new ones as an addition to the original scale, such as actually feeling that you're dying, or the experience of entering a kind of gateway and the crossing of like a threshold. I won't actually be looking in depth with you at the phenomenology of DMT, as I have in previous talks, but this is the gross kind of structure of my thematic analysis of the DMT experience, part of which, this part here, being already published in Frontiers in December. So just to say that there is actually quite clearly a structural phenomenological overlap between DMT and near-death experiences, given that you do certainly dissociate from the body, you seem to enter into another space or other worlds, and you encounter other beings. And of course, there is a subset of experience which are very, very correlating with the classical kind of near-death experience, but we will go more into depth with that regarding Changa and 5-MeO. So this is other people's work to suggest the similarity between near-death and DMT. So this is Chris Timmerman Imperial finding that, again, the features on the NDE scale are insignificantly different between DMT and the near-death experience. This also is an adaptation because it includes myself and David Luke's field study of DMT experiences, so inhaled DMT experiences, and finding that ours very much correlate with Chris Timmerman's in the lab. But interestingly, there are some interesting differences, such as the feature of encountering a mystical being being much more prevalent in our field study, and even more common than the classical near-death experiences, which are denoted by the blue. But also it's quite clear that there's a certain subcluster of experiences near the bottom here, which in both of at the DMT studies were different, but at least insignificantly different, incidentally, to near-death experiences. But in our field study, there were certain ones which deviated more from the classical near-death experience, such as encountering the deceased, which may well imply that there certainly is a kind of subpopulation of features which are kind of more unique to the NDE versus the DMT experience, for instance. Again, more work suggesting that there's quite a range of psychoactive substances whose semantic kind of content very much overlaps with the near-death experience. So these are the most similar on the top right here, and the most similar actually came up as ketamine and then salvia, incidentally, but then most of the ones preceding that are of the classical psychedelic or dissociative atypical psychedelic variety, of which DMT is one. Again, I'm not going to go through in so much detail comparing NN-DMT with the near-death experience, which will be the subject of my one of my ensuing papers, hopefully. But I will just say that the general process was to look at both the frequency of the themes in our field study of DMT on the left column here, and then also the near-death experience from raw data, which was granted us by the Coma Science Group in the University of Liège. But I will just quickly say that there are some clear differences just in terms of the presence or not, so i.e. the quantity and the quantitative differences as opposed to the qualitative differences, which we'll get to in just one moment, such as the concept of there being a space of darkness through which one travels toward an emerging bright light, and that was only present in the near-death experience and totally absent in the DMT experience. However, there certainly was some periods of darkness, and there certainly were tunnel-like structures in our DMT study, but not in the way that it's presented in the near-death experience. In terms of encountering other beings, there were a smorgasbord of different beings associated with both experiences, but the content of them, the very kind of nuanced way in which they were manifest, are different, as I'll get to in a moment as well. But just to say again, in terms of the quantitative presence and absence, deceased relatives were one of the most common experiences in the near-death experience, and certainly one of the least common in the near-death experience, in the DMT experience, sorry, which mirrors what I just mentioned in with the near-death experience scale in the last slide. Again, the concept of being communicated by a being that you're going to be returning to life is something which maybe intuitively was only really present in the near-death experience and certainly absent in the DMT. So in terms of the qualitative comparison, this is quite core, really a fulcrum to my research, that the content, the very specific way it's qualitatively manifested, is ultimately always different between the two experiences. And I can just demonstrate this very, very quickly with just one concrete example of the kind of how this being of light, for instance, might manifest between the two. So on the left, you have the near-death experience, which I won't read it all, but basically just expresses this idea of a very hyper advanced and extremely benevolent sentience which seems to emanate light. And on the right, you can see one of our participants from our field study who basically describes exactly the same thing in all of those features, other than the kind of more visual way in which it manifests itself. And it's actually quite octopus-like, tentacled, or this person analogizes it to synapses. So that's just one example of the kind of patent content difference between them. Now, turning to Changa. So as I mentioned, Changa is DMT associated with monoaminoxidase inhibitor containing herbs. And we have two case studies here. One SR who had both. So crucially, these are individuals who themselves had both these Changa experiences and near-death experiences on different occasions. So, and what is most crucial about this is that you can simply ask these participants, rather than as a detached kind of investigator to delineate the differences yourself, you can ask them directly, someone with a unique vantage point, what they believe the similarities and differences were. And SR, for instance, said that the NDE did feel very, very similar to the near-death, to the DMT experience. They all interconnected and overlapped. The same feeling overlaid the whole experience in parallel spaces. And importantly, he said when he subsequently had the DMT experience, it was basically like having a deja vu of the near-death experience. And in terms of quantitatively asking them about their appraisal of the relationship, he said that the Changa near-death experience was 8 out of 10 in terms of how similar they were, and he gave a 10 out of 10 in terms of him believing that some kind of endogenous psychedelic could have led to his actual subsequent near-death experience. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I will just say that in a similar fashion to what I conducted with comparing the NDE and the near-death, this is a more quantitative analysis of the features that were present or not present between his Changa and near-death. And ultimately, there were actually substantial differences to this individual's own near-death experience and his Changa experience. But when you compare differences between his Changa experience and the near-death kind of literature and phenomenology in general, it's very, very similar. The only real differences are these kind of idiosyncratically quintessential psychedelic-like features, like the presence of synesthesia or pixelation in visual experience and geometry fractal experiences, the presence of kind of code and an entity which kind of manifested as having this sort of mysterious blue sort of Phantom of the Opera type sort of mask, which is certainly not something you generally get with near-death experiences. I will, just for time, just skip over the second Changa experience, but ultimately it comes out with very, very consistent results, as what I just described with the first participant. So 5-MeO-DMT. So people may recognize eventually who this particular near-death experiencer is, but he was pseudonymed as Nikolai, but he was a North American male, 54 years of age at the time of his near-death experience, and he documented his near-death experience in a popularly published book in 2012. He scored very, very high on the near-death experience scale, and his NDE was induced by bacterial meningoencephalitis, and was in very deep coma for a lot of that one week. But he then reported a subsequent 5-MeO DMT experience, about which I interviewed him, and also quantitatively asked his appraisal of the similarities between his 5-MeO and his near-death experience, and he only gave a 2 out of 10, and he also gave a 2 out of 10 to indicate his belief that any kind of endogenous chemical like DMT could have led to his own near-death experience. And this is interesting because he, compared to the previous 2 case studies with Changa, has actually had very, very little of his own personal psychedelic experiences. And this may imply that when you have more of these psychedelic experiences, you have a greater repertoire and your background of understanding in order to cross-reference between your own NDE and what is possible within the realm of psychedelic phenomenology, to then come to the conclusion that actually they are more similar than one might originally believe. And him giving these low scores might indicate that that might be a process going on here, given that his 5-MeO DMT experience had very, very many features similar to near-death experiences, such as transcendence of time and space and other mystical type experiences such as ego dissolution and the unitive experience. And this really was the core of the overlap between his 2 experiences. If you look at other pieces of the phenomenology of his near-death experience, which wasn't exactly manifest in his 5-MeO experience, but is certainly identifiable in psychedelic phenomenology in general, then these would be features such as meeting divine or menacing beings, going to other Earth-like worlds, experiencing a kind of void, synesthetic experiences, encountering the deceased loved ones, many features. So ultimately, his near-death experience could be reproducible by psychedelics, and the core mystical domain was certainly present in both of his experiences. In terms of his near-death experience and how that might illuminate certain mechanisms for it, I won't go into detail in this either, but it was very, very, very enlightening to identify elements of his near-death experience which looked like lucid dreams, such as his quotes here saying, "To know and be able to think of something is all one needs in order to move toward it," or imagine your tears would bring on a torrential downpour and your joy would make the clouds instantly disappear. So this concept of mind manifestation of his experience, which is very much like a lucid dream, but importantly, something which is reproducible by psychedelics themselves, classical psychedelics, that is. Also, perinatal regression, incredibly patent, really, when you look at the account in detail, that there's a lot of these processes going on, such as him saying that it was like he regressed to the beginnings of life. It was in a muddy womb, and he felt like he was being born, not just born again, akin to the fetus in a womb, and he had a silent partner of a placenta, etc. So you can read his original account at your own behest. But ultimately, just to finish up, really, other than just a last-minute conclusion, and this is something, again, a paper which I've put in for publication, the idea that the very unique etiology of his meningoencephalitis in the higher laminae of the cortex, it may well possibly constitute a different trigger to classical psychedelic action. So 5-MeO DMT need not necessarily be released in his brain, but it is still conversion upon very similar downstream mechanisms. So that being top-down cortical disinhibition of major cortical nodes, so that could lead to the release of bottom-up intrinsic cortical or subcortical information, which then converges on a really massive expansion of conscious experience. And so in the psychedelic, so the concept of psychedelics being directly involved, that would be the triggering of the 5-HT2A receptor of the layer 5 pyramidal cells. But in the case of his meningoencephalitis, it could still lead to this ultimate release of bottom-up intrinsic information and therefore an expansion of consciousness, but actually originally triggered by damage to his neocortical laminae. And there's several papers to suggest that similar processes certainly happen, such as in frontotemporal dementia or autism, for instance. Again, just for the matter of time, I'm going to skip over this, but we have certainly looked at the models, the different models of DMT, Changa, 5-MeO DMT, and looked at the possible neural correlates of the near-death experience in the case of this one particular popularly published near-death experiencer, which in and of itself could actually be related to all near-death experiences in the sense that there is high level breakdown within the brain neurohierarchy because of anoxic disruption. So just to finish as a conclusion, and these mirroring the very first headlines which I had at the very first slide. So while the different experiences, DMT and near-death, look similar enough, there are actually very many differences on the level of content, and so you could consider DMT or these other analogs occasional, but even then just partial NDE-ogens, for instance. And there it may actually be that DMT is kind of physiologically impossible to actually majorly contribute to the near-death experience because of the idea that it can't be released in high enough quantities, and even if it did, the massive deluge of serotonin, which does actually seem to occur in rat models of death, may well displace the DMT from the receptors. What is also the case is that there may well be far more than DMT that's occurring in terms of the neurochemical cocktail at the point of near death, and so it's a myopic thing to focus only on DMT when there are many other neurochemical players also, but also the idea that it need not be DMT, in that, similar to what I was saying about the downstream mechanisms converging between endogenous psychedelics and disabling of the higher level cortex. There could be other triggers, endogenous triggers, such as ketamine-like chemicals or salvia-like chemicals like dynorphin, which are all different triggers, different receptor systems in the brain, but all of these have actually been identified to disintegrate the default mode network, which is a very core resting state network within our brain. Also, while it may make evolutionary sense that these psychoplastogens are released in an anoxic brain, there is a massive question as to why it's experiential at all, and especially mystically experiential. And however, saying that, it may be the case that even these experiential elements would be selected for, given that there is evidence that the NDE and psychedelics have pro-social effects and community kind of cohering effects as well. Paradoxical awareness. So this is the very last point, the concept that the near-death state, people may well be clinically dead, yet reporting internal experiences and awareness. And as I hypothesized in another paper, which is in press in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, at least in the state of people in anesthetic states, when they report near-death experiences, and maybe the endogenous psychoactive chemicals are released and essentially supersede the anesthetic action of the brain. And when you combine the concept with the idea that in coma-like states, the entropy, that is the kind of chaos of the neural motifs in the brain, is very, very low and diminished, whereas psychedelics increase them fundamentally. They increase the entropic state of the brain. And so this has actually been considered in terms of using psychedelics as a medicine for people in coma that may release them into having internal states, or even allowing them to emerge into into connecting with the world again. So in that respect, there's very, very deep theoretical neuroscientific reasons to think that it might be endogenous psychedelics, or at least the downstream mechanisms thereof, which is leading to the internal awareness that they then paradoxically report. So I will leave it there, and thank you very, very much indeed.